MaxieJane Frazier. My essay is Here is Where My War Story Begins. And my excerpt happens right after there was an aircraft crash when I was deployed to the transit center at Manas in Kyrgyzstan. In 1 hour, we were supposed to develop a bilingual press release and coordinate it through the U.S. Embassy, whose operations had already ceased for the weekend. My SIM card died and, with it, my cell phone, an archaic little item that required me to relearn T9 texting skills. My base email address wouldn't send to the embassy, and no one else had their email addresses. My colleagues at the Air Force press desk at the Pentagon were beginning their Friday duty day to the news of the crash. They were banging down my virtual door for a press release. Friendships were strained as the man from the Pentagon who had been my boss a month ago begged me to get that release done. I insisted on holding out until the Kyrgyz people could be informed at the same time as the U.S. media and public. We needed the Russian translation. 2 hours later, I released a press statement that told the world terrible news about the crash and our search for the three-person crew. Photos of the site promised the search would be futile. I didn't expect the grief, the pain, the loss that accompanied those photos. I had passed through the dining hall with that flight crew. 2 days later, when the flight crew's families and friends provided pictures for our memorial service, I saw familiar faces. Some irrational part of me thought I could just look in the more remote corners of the base, poke my head into a darkened movie room, and see these 3 young faces turn and say, "You were looking for us?" Every person I encountered in that Air Force wing felt the absence of these 3 young airmen. I couldn't help but think that we felt the casualties even more because we operated from the peaceful edges of war. Tragedy seemed so out of place there. I love Jill Kerr Conway's notion that memoir is an opportunity to try on other people's lives. And I'm also deeply committed to the notion that we tell stories to know not only ourselves as individuals, but to know who we are as humans. But I write both memoir and fiction. I earned a dual genre degree because I'm committed to both. And I think both forms are essential for addressing our human condition. I've been fascinated with memoir for more than 2 decades. In my coursework for my doctorate, I wrote about authors who wrote both fiction and then at the end of their writing careers wrote autobiography. While I was studying, I learned so much about the psychology of memory and the ways that people center themselves as the main characters of all the events in their memory. This action has to do, of course, with narrative point of view and the perception that we really are the center of all of our experiences. But to step back and discover just how skewed our own experience can be is fascinating. I remember having this conversation with my family about the flawed quality of memory, and they jumped right in to tell me how my memory was wrong and, ironically, how theirs was right. In other words, we are so convinced by our own point of view that we want to prove others wrong about their self-centered viewpoints. And figuring all of this out was life-changing for me. Once I could set aside my rigid understanding of the past and my present, I began to realize that the concept of truth is so flexible that deciding whether or not something is true often comes out as something as ambiguous as it depends. And maybe this is why I like to write both fiction and nonfiction, as well as study people who do both. Here's Where My War Story Begins is a rumination about what it means to be in the military, have a story to tell, and not fit a traditional, trauma hero narrative that has dominated military memoirs. I was both a public affairs officer, and think of that as like public relations, and a literature and composition teacher for more than a decade at the U.S. Air Force Academy. And I want the more normal military stories to gain traction and to help the rest of the public to understand how those of us who served in the military have had common, important life experiences on top of the exotic deployments and combat that attract people's attention. So I still focus my essay on deployed experiences, partly because those were the times I could say I was literally in combat zones, even if I found myself training for marathons, enjoying Friday night pizza and movies, and doing a lot of reading. My daily activities were a mix of the normal and abnormal, and I wanted to share that. So the deployments I write about in this piece are pivotal in my experience as well. Going to Afghanistan was a critical 6 months because it was dangerous. There were improvised explosive devices, people who would have loved to harm us, real threats. And Kyrgyzstan was also important because even though we were in a friendly country, I had to deal with a tragic aircraft crash. I saw a dead body in a highway accident, and it's the only deployment where I saw a gun trained on a U.S. service member. That juxtaposition, the idea that I faced more tangible threats in my easy deployment, emphasized my need to just get unexpected military stories out in the public. I was working in the Air Force Academy Department of English and Fine Arts at the time, and that meant that I was in proximity with the journal War, Literature, and the Arts on a daily basis. I had this narrative, the one that ended up being this essay, bubbling up, and I hoped when I got it down that maybe it would find a home in our journal. So I ended up writing it, revising it, showing it to my talented friends in the department, revising it, and then learning that it really didn't fit for our journal. Jesse Goolsby, he's a fellow Air Force officer and also the author of 2 books. I would walk with my friends if I could find them in acceleration hours. He introduced me to the editors at Consequence magazine, who thought that the piece was a perfect fit for their publication. So I worked closely with the founder, George Kovacs, to get it polished, and I'm really grateful for that time because unfortunately we lost him about a year ago. So it was a lot of reminiscence and writing and mostly revising. Amazingly, I spent about 3 or 4 months actively working on it and revising it with my colleagues and myself before it found its home at Consequence, and I think that's really short. I think most of my writing takes more time than that. So it's rough because really I have 2 tips, so please hang in here with me. But my tip on writing memoir is really more like 2, because my biggest tip for nonfiction writers is to gain enough distance from their experience to be able to write about themselves and their past as if it's happening to another character or person. In other words, you have to gain objectivity in order to really be honest and to interpret the patterns that emerge from our lives. Brené Brown, speaking on Elizabeth Gilbert's podcast Magic Lessons, said that you have to be far enough away from something that when you receive heavy criticism about it, you can handle it. If your experience is fresh enough that commenting trolls can hurt your feelings, you probably have to wait to write it. But perhaps, and this advice I think is maybe even more important, is that nonfiction writers should spend a little time studying about the creative nonfiction craft. There are so many smart people out there who have done the hard work of figuring out what's unique about nonfiction, especially the nonfiction written with creative writing techniques of fiction. If people wanted an easy creative read on this, there's Tim O'Brien's How to Tell a True War Story from his novel The Things They Carried, which addresses the questions of story truth versus happening truth. And there's so many craft books I would want to recommend, such as Vivian Gordick's The Situation in the Story, Philip Lopate's To Show and to Tell, Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, Mary Carr's The Art of Memoir, Henny Dillard's The Writing Life, Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones, and so many more. And if people read Francine Prose's Reading Like a Writer, they can just use her suggestions to read fantastic memoir essays and figure it out for themselves. They could go into the past and read people like MFK Fisher's The Gastronomical Me. These are book length, but Lucy Greeley's The Autobiography of a Face, anything by Mary Carr, but starting with The Liars Club, Helen McDonald's H.S. Frog. I mean, there are so many more. Hannah Howard, Padma Lakshmi, Hope Jaron, Cheryl Strayed. The list is really endless, and anyone writing memoirs should be immersing themselves in the craft and learning from the talented people already published. I saved this one aside because I think the very best short piece of memoir out there is Joanne Beard's The Fourth State of Matter, which was originally published on June 24th, 1996 in The New Yorker, and it later became a part of her incredible book, The Boys of My Youth. It deals with a 90s active shooter event at the University of Iowa. Her figurative language is luscious, and yet she also offers a really tight narrative arc, so full of compelling characters and concrete details that we can't help but keep reading. So I hope you'll bear with me. I just want to offer the opening lines for you, just so you can hear that there's such a promise that she delivers on in the essay. It goes like this. The Milky Way is a long smear on the sky, like something erased on a blackboard. Over the neighbor's house, Mars flashes white, then red, then white again. Jupiter is hidden among the anonymous blinks and glitterings. It has a moon with sulfur-spewing volcanoes and a beautiful name, Io. I learned it at work from the group of men who surround me there. Space physicists, guys who spend days on end with their heads poked through the fabric of the sky, listening to the sounds of the universe. Guys whose own lives are ticking like alarm clocks, getting ready to go off, although none of us are aware of it yet. And she goes on, there's a aging collie, a beauty queen who's capturing squirrels, a departing husband who still cares about her. This is exactly the kind of writing that I admire and I'd like to aspire to. Oh, I'd love to give a shout out to a new journal with Columbia University. It's called The Line Literary Review, and I'm really grateful. They just published another piece of mine called First Unbecoming about a month ago, and it's really energetic, and they're committed to giving veterans voices, and I'm just excited that people understand that that's important.